Hello everyone, this is part 30 of What If Naruto Was Abused and Leaves Konoha, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Naruto was so confused by the strange man's words that he almost missed the Asura path leaping at him. As it was, he had enough time to duck down, letting the semi-mechanical man sail overhead. At the last moment he struck out, grabbing one of his many hands before using it to slam the man into the ground, hard. Dust was sent bursting into the air as Naruto leapt back from the fresh crater he had just made with the man's body. It proved to be a mistake as he re-emerged from the smoke, raising one of his arms at Naruto, who watched as it seemed to separate. He blinked once at the odd tube-like contraption inside the arm, being reminded once again of Sasori in the way the Asura Path's body seemed to be filled with weapons. His blink turned into a look of disbelief as something was promptly fired from the arm, sailing towards him at astonishing speeds. Naruto leapt to the side, but not before he felt whatever it was graze his shirt. He tucked into a roll as he hit the ground, turning in time to see the launched bomb reduce the building behind him into rubble. Naruto looked at the smoking crater that had once been a clothes store in shock before pushing off the ground hard as he heard another of the projectiles getting let loose. Again he dodged it, but not by much. Even with his healing factor he wasn't going to survive being blown apart. He knew from experience that this was only scratching the tip of the iceberg of weapons the Asura Path no doubt stored in its body. Not wanting to find out about the rest, he came up with a plan, grinning as he dodged a third missile. Feeling the familiar rush of chakra through his system, time around him ground to almost a stop. He could see everything around him in almost perfect clarity, even pieces of rubble that just seemed to be moving lazily through the air like it was treacle. He rushed forward, kicking up a trail of sand behind him from the sheer speed he was moving. When he got close enough, he smirked as he saw one of the bombs about to leave its tube. The man's eyes were only just beginning to follow him in shock, but he didn't give him the chance as he quickly jabbed a kunai into the tube. Dashing off to the other side of the square, he turned in time to see the man blink once before the area around him erupted into flame and heat. Time warped for Naruto before everything caught up to him, rubble falling at the right speed again. He watched, panting from the exertion the technique put on his body, looking for any sign that the Asura Path had survived. He grinned when he saw a pile of machinery that looked vaguely human-shaped smoldering at the bottom of a crater, its warped and slightly melted tail blade glinting in the sun. He didn't get long to celebrate before he was sent hurtling forward by some unseen, but definitely felt, force. He groaned in the crater he had created on impact, picking himself up while clutching his head, Kyuubi working overtime to fix him up. He looked around, clutching his healing ribs with slowly refocusing eyes that picked up the form of a spiky orange-haired man looking at him with irritation. Strangely, he almost seemed to allow Naruto to recover, letting him stagger out of the crater before managing to stand straighter. "Oh right, I forgot about you." Gaara observed the two men, buried up to their necks in sand, as calmly as he could. However, between the six of them they had already managed to damage his village extensively. He narrowed his eyes and he closed his hands slowly, letting their bodies sink beneath the sands as he gradually increased the pressure on their bodies. Already he could feel his control over the larger man slipping as he used his annoying ability to drain away chakra. He tried to crush the other man before he could do anything, but he found his control over the sand around him as well. In desperation he clenched his hand shut, forcing whatever sand was still under his control to violently contract, hopefully crushing everything below him. Feeling a slight tremor beneath him, he quickly formed a platform out of his sand before letting it carry him upwards, just as a strong hand burst out of the ground, intent on grabbing his leg. He watched with cold eyes as both of the orange-haired men pulled themselves up out of the sand. However, the Naruto Path was now missing an arm. Gold dust, 1,000 phantom blades. He propelled the tiny golden particles forward as fast as he could, releasing them in a constant stream from the seal on his palm. However, the Predator Path quickly launched himself into their path, arms outstretched. Before he lost control, he diverted the particles, bringing them back to him to lazily orbit him as a ring of gold. His eyes narrowed in irritation, trying to come up with a solution to the problem the Predator Path posed. However, even as he gazed at them evenly, the fingers of his right hand twitched ever so slightly. Once again he sent a barrage of the dust down at the two of them, and once again the Predator path met it head-on. However, at the last moment he cut his connection with the dust, allowing the heavy particles to be carried forward by their own momentum instead of with his chakra. The Predator path was unprepared for this and quickly raised its arms to shield its eye from being blinded. Gaara smirked, suddenly focusing all his attention on one spot behind the Naruto path as more gold dust he had hidden there earlier burst outwards. Gold dust, Kinpaku tomb. The flurry of gold particles attacked the man, however instead of acting like a blade it began to congeal across his body, covering it with a fine layer of gold. The last thing to be covered were his eyes, staring up at Gaara in defiance even as his body froze, unable to move with the heavy coating of gold. Gaara paused for a moment before clenching his hand closed. The effects were immediate and the golden statue that was once the Naruto path began to glow brilliantly. The gold dust heated up, melting onto the man before fusing together forever, sealing his fate as a glittering gilded statue. Immediately the other path rushed over, placing its hands on the statue to try and absorb the chakra, only to recoil before the scalding metal burned through his hands. There was no chakra left in the statue anyway. Gaara didn't need to maintain it once the actual gold dust had melted together. He would be able to break it down later into its particle form, but for now he still had to focus on the enemy that was left. Do you know what temperature gold melts at? The Predator path stared at him blankly, with possibly a hint of irritation. Taking its silence as an invitation to continue, Gaara did so. 1000 degrees Celsius. By now the man inside of there is nothing but ash. The sands began to swarm around him, forming a loose shell that could harden at any moment. Your fate will be much worse. Tayuya dodged again, finding that right now it was all she could do. The human path had sped up remarkably, now apparently taking her as an actual threat. Already it had thrown Matsuri across the street and Tayuya could only hope the girl was okay. She couldn't check herself. Parrying a blow from one of the chakra rods, she tried to feint to the left and get inside the man's guard, only to be swatted away casually. She landed in a three-point stance, staff up behind her in the air before she slammed it, point down, into the ground. Treble tremor. It erupted in front of her as she sent incredible amounts of lightning chakra through the earth, heading in a somewhat straight line towards the human path. He was caught off guard, reacting too slow before electricity arced up all around him, passing through his foot even as the path jumped away. He landed, a little unsteadily, with one of his feet completely numbed below the ankle, causing him to stumble. She noticed him blink once as he looked off to the left, towards where some of the other battles were taking place. It was only a momentary hesitation, but it was all Tayuya needed as she sprung forward, launching her staff ahead of her like a spear. The human path could only blink in shock as he looked down, finding a large 5-foot metal bow staff embedded right in the center of his chest. Tayuya smirked as she rushed forward to deliver the finishing blow, however she was expecting the man to be cringing in pain, unable to move from the lighting chakra coursing from the pole. That was why she was too surprised to act when his arm flashed out, roughly grabbing her by the top of her head. Instantly she felt the all-too-familiar feeling return as the life was slowly and literally pulled out of her being. The man said nothing this time, only staring at her with those cold, almost lifeless eyes. Tayuya actually found herself trembling slightly as she sunk to her knees, the strength in her legs leaving her entirely. Color drained away from her vision as the coldness permeated her very being. She felt something trickle down her face before she realized it was a tear. A single ice-cold droplet of water leaked from her eyes as she stared back at the orange-haired man. She was crying because she didn't want to die, not like this. She may have put on a tough facade around others, but Tayuya truly feared death. She wanted to live so that she could grow up with Naruto, so that she could continue to hold him at night, feeling his warmth through her. She didn't want to leave him alone the world, and however selfish it sounded, she wanted to be the only woman he loved. As more tears streamed down her face, the seal on her shoulder began to glow a warm blue, meekly at first but quickly growing in intensity. Her hair grew out, longer and fuller as it took on a bright pink hue. Her eyes shifted, becoming pools of pure emerald that continued to cry tears in rivulets. Her body grew in places as muscles also strengthened, naturally becoming infused with chakra as a massive influx overcame her body. Nature chakra flooded in through the seal, quickly converted to something she could use, and use it she did. It was almost unnoticeable at first through the darkness that was clouding her vision, but as soon as she saw that bright patch of blonde she clung to it, not letting go for 1 second. Without even realizing it, her hand twitched, gaining life as the cold pallid tone that had overcome it receded for a moment. It slowly moved up before with trembling fingers it wrapped around cold metal. Reacting purely on instincts by this point Tayuya released all of her pain and anger through that contact, pouring it all out in the form of unbridled and unrestrained chakra. The bow staff glowed brightly from all the energy rushing through it before the man's eyes widened uncontrollably. Every muscles in his body suddenly contracted and he lost the ability to control it. His grip on the redhead's hair loosened, allowing Tayuya to fall to the ground. However, her hold on her staff didn't waver. Regaining control over her body, she only increased the flow as the human path began to smoke, being cooked from the inside out by the violent lightning chakra coursing through his body. Tayuya slowly regained her strength, managing to get to her feet unsteadily, staring at the dying man with merciless emerald eyes. Like hell, I'm fucking dying in the middle of the fucking street like a rat. And with that she let go of her staff, but not before passing one last massive pulse of chakra through it, giving it everything she had left. The human path was unable to do anything for a moment, his muscles locked in place by the electricity still coursing through it. Then, like a puppet with its strings cut, he simply dropped to the ground, motionless. Tayuya cautiously walked over, kicking him once to check that he was really dead before sighing in relief. After this was all over, she was going to seriously thank Naruto for that seal, it had literally saved her life. She never intended to get that close to death again, not until she could live the life she wanted with Naruto on her own terms. Her eyes widened for a moment as she realized that Matsuri was still hurt and she quickly rushed over to see what she could do, or even if she could help. Fu smiled weakly as she watched the body of the animal path rocket towards the ground, flying after him to make sure he didn't try anything. She was almost expecting him to somehow produce another summon, saving himself from the deadly descent. However, she was relieved when he simply impacted on the ground, the street exploding around him from the force behind the impact. Lightly she fluttered down, only to find she had interrupted Naruto's fight with the Deva path, both of them now looking at the crater, one in shock and the other without emotion. Fu, watch out. The mint-haired girl spun to the side on her older brother's warning, narrowly avoiding getting bitten clean through as a large dog jumped through the space she had been hovering. To her surprise, when the dust and debris cleared, she could clearly see the animal path standing, somewhat weakly, at the center of the deep hole his body had formed. Fu spun in the air again to avoid another dog, this one definitely aiming to clamp its jaws around her neck. She dropped to the ground to avoid a third before backpedaling, unknowingly bumping up against Naruto. The two spun before recognizing one another. Each smiled at the other, but only briefly before both their eyes widened. Fu was about to cry out to her brother, but not before he suddenly tackled her to the floor, letting two snarling dogs sail over both of them, letting them both take the Shinra Tensei at full force. They were blasted back ferociously, but didn't make it very far before bursting into smoke. Naruto threw Fu to the side and quickly unsealed two familiar blades, throwing them over to her. The mint-haired girl caught them deftly, looking at them. A little surprised Naruto had given her the Kiba. What am I supposed to do with these? Naruto grinned manically at her, jumping to the right as he avoided getting blasted by another invisible attack. Do what I do, swing 'em at random and really hope you hit something. He couldn't get any more out before he was violently flung high into the air, taking a glancing Shinra Tensei that had him spinning. Fu just nodded in determination as she spun to meet the animal path, her eyes opening in shock as she suddenly found two black rods swinging at her. She brought the blades up on instinct, trying to block the attack. To both her and the animal path's surprise, the black rods were neatly bisected in two. Fu blinked once before grinning, lashing out with the two swords, trying to slice the orange-haired man in two. He jumped back, pulling his hands into a seal as he did so. Immediately a large panda burst out of a cloud of smoke, attempting to gore Fu with its large claws. She just jumped at it, using her wings to propel herself forward at speed with the two razor-sharp swords out in front of her. Like a small green drill, she burst out of the other side, spinning furiously, not even looking back as the panda disappeared in smoke. She grinned as the animal path put its hands together again for another summoning. However, Fu didn't let him this time, instead launching one of the swords at him. It was aimed at his chest, but he jumped out of the way, only letting it skim his arm, drawing a thin trail of blood. Unfortunately for him, he had jumped directly into the path of the second Kiba. This time he was unable to move and it pierced him directly through the chest, pinning him securely to the wall behind him. Fu dropped to the ground, now huffing slightly, never having been in a fight this hard. The animal path observed her coldly, unable to move but showing no sign. He even felt the shining sword sticking out of his rib cage. Fu caught her breath and stood up straighter, clutching her wrist like she had injured it. Energy began to coalesce in her palm even as the animal path raised a hand to Kiba's hilt, pulling it slowly out of his body and by extension the wall. Fu was nowhere near as good with the Rasengan as her brother, but he had taught her enough for this one last move. Firefly Rasengan. She charged forward even as the ball of energy in her palm contracted down to the size of a small insect, glowing even brighter from the condensed energies. She thrust her hand forward, burying her palm into the orange-haired man's chest. She panted from holding back the energy before she finally let it go, using her wings to quickly pull herself back and into the sky. The animal path finally freed itself from the wall, pulling the sword from his body while ignoring the strange feeling in his chest. Fu just smirked before the street was filled with a blinding light as all of the chakra contained within the tiny sphere finally burst out all at once, shredding everything in its path. When the bright light finally faded, there was nothing left of the animal path but the occasional scrap of black cloth that floated down from the sky. Fu finally breathed a sigh of relief before falling to her knees, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. I did it, Onisan. She quickly passed out on the ground, her body too tired to keep going. Gaara was forced to move backwards, raising the platform he was standing on away from the Preta path, which continued to try and get close to him. Each time it would come close, only for Gaara to move further away and try and swat him down with a whip of sand. The large man would then proceed to absorb the chakra in the sand before it could cause him any real damage, landing securely on the ground below him. They continued this strange back and forth dance for a while, neither really able to gain the upper hand on the other. Finally though, Gaara had enough time to think, and a Gaara that had a plan was a dangerous enemy. The next time the Preta path landed, he suddenly found more sand spikes leaping out of the ground to skewer him. He raised his hands to dissipate them, but before they got too close they suddenly flared. What was left was a thinner, but more compact translucent spike. He still tried to absorb the attack, only to find no chakra in the blade of glass, allowing it to cut into his hand in a moment of hesitation. Now that Gaara had an advantage, he pressed it mercilessly, forcing the larger man to dodge and weave as glass spikes began to shoot out of every surface. They shattered on impact when they missed and gained glancing blows when they didn't, drawing more and more blood each time. Even as he had the orange-haired man dancing around on the ground to avoid him, he began to gather a large cloud of sand above him, compressing it further and further until it weighed more than a house. It glowed, being heated up until the sand particles fused, their molecular structures being reformatted until an enormous block of glass floated above the square. Gaara could only barely control it in this form, so he just let it fall to the floor, directly on top of the Preta path. The large man could only look up as the massive translucent block descended on his body. He was already sprinting to the side, but he knew he wouldn't make it out in time. Before it hit, Gaara exerted the last portion of control he could, shattering the block into thousands of deadly and chakra-free shards that quickly covered every inch of the square. He calmly observed the end of his rather anticlimactic battle, ignoring the ugly red stain on the ground in favor of trying to find where Naruto was fighting, hoping to help if it was necessary. He needed to put a stop to this before something bad happened to his friends, or his village. Naruto had lost count how many times he had gotten close to pain only to be swiftly launched back by some invisible force. It was like the man was untouchable, lending at least some credibility to his constant ranting about how he was a god. Naruto tried to tune it out the best he could. Religious fanatics kind of bugged him at the best of times. In the middle of a fight where he seemed to be doing negligible damage was even worse. He got to his feet after climbing out of one of the numerous Naruto-shaped craters that now littered the street they had been fighting in. Suddenly he felt his grip on the ground loosen as he was pulled forward, his arms flailing uselessly behind him as he hurtled towards pain. The man had one hand extended out to him while a long chakra rod slid from his sleeve, held ready to pierce Naruto's body. Quickly Naruto flashed away, landing on a roof where one of his kunai had fallen earlier in the fight. There were a few scattered around, but like he had just done, they were only good for getting away. He couldn't get close enough to pain to utilize the technique fully. He sighed, putting his hand into a now almost instinctual seal before hundreds of copies of himself suddenly appeared all around the street, lining every rooftop. Pain seemed unconcerned by the sudden influx of orange surrounding him, even when they all simultaneously launched themselves at the man. He waited until the last minute, when all the Narutos were as close as they could be without touching him. One of the clones even had a smile on its face as it reared back its fist, hoping to finally land the first strike on Pain. Shinra Tensei. Simultaneously all of the clones winced as they were blasted back, the shockwave of force moving in every direction. However, what Pain didn't see thanks to the sea of orange covering his view were the few clones that stayed behind the rest, just staying on the outskirts of the attack. They finally landed, one of them hurling its fist right between Pain's eyes, startling the normally unflappable Akatsuki member as he was sent flying back. His back was struck as one of the clones waiting behind him kicked him up into the sky, only to be smacked right back down by an improvised axe kick. Pain crashed to the floor, finally creating a crater of his own, even as he pushed away a few more clones that got too cocky. He stood back up, narrowing his eyes at Naruto as the boy jumped back into the street, staring defiantly over at Pain with a smirk. I knew it, there's a delay before you can use that attack again, a few seconds maybe. The spiky-haired man's eyes narrowed, the rings around his iris looking like they were actually rippling. Not many people have ever lived long enough to work that out. Naruto's smile only grew bigger before it reset into a more serious expression. Cockiness could come later. He heard the footsteps before he saw who it was, turning to spot Tayuya running towards him, seal activated and staff at the ready. At the same time Naruto spotted Gaara soaring over the buildings on a platform of sand as his smirk reappeared on his face. He joined his friends in rushing the orange-haired man, each of them coming from a different direction intending to attack him from all sides. Naruto, being the closest, was the first to be attacked with Pain simply raising his hand as he had done for the entirety of the fight. Shinra Tens, Naruto didn't allow him to finish as he disappeared in a yellow flash, reappearing no more than a millisecond later with two other clones beneath the man as they delivered joint devastating kicks, straight up. N.A. Ru. 2. He launched Pain into the air catching the unsuspecting man unawares with the use of a seal he had just managed to place the last and only time he had touched him. Sand sound barrage. Pain looked around midair to see an enormous whip of air spear towards him even as Tayuya, covered in lightning chakra, came barreling in from the other side. Pain's eyes only narrowed momentarily before the air around him rippled violently. There was a moment as time seemed to freeze to a standstill, all four fighters watching each other with trained eyes. Then it was over and the area around Pain erupted like no other explosion, the ground just seemingly blowing outwards like it was hit by an invisible asteroid. Gaara managed to shield himself with sand, getting tossed backwards like a leaf in a storm while Tayuya took the full brunt of the attack, being thrown backwards through more than a few buildings. Naruto saw this out of the corner of his eye but was unable to do anything about it as he turned, sending as much chakra as he could through his body before sprinting at an ungodly pace away from the sphere of destruction very quickly expanding behind him. Gaara managed to recover, high up over his village as he watched with wide eyes at the destruction a single attack had wrought. Over half the village, gone, just like that. There was nothing but one enormous crater, the only thing that told of anything being there before was the surrounding buildings. A single tear slid down the young Kazekige's cheek as he looked at his precious village, reduced to a near pile of rubble. Luckily he wasn't too far gone that he could reach out with all his power, halting the massive flow of rubble and earth that was spreading out from where Pain floated. It took all his concentration but he finally caught the massive wave of what used to be buildings, and more than likely his citizens, before it could wipe the rest of Sunagakure off of the map. His senses were fuzzy as he floated there, already feeling the effects of severe chakra exhaustion overtaking his body as he limply began to descend to the ground, only slowed by his sand. He only hoped that Naruto could finish this, he had nothing left. Naruto could only look around him at the destruction, buildings lying in ruin at the edge of the crater, fires springing up at random from the destruction, then the crater itself. One giant plain of almost glassed sand, smoothed by the invisible force that had caused it, and there, in the center, stood Pain. Except a part of Naruto really didn't care about that, he was already running, straight out over the crater that used to be the center of Suna. Except he didn't run towards Pain, he ran around the edge of the crater, staring in horror at the small path of destruction Tayuya's body had caused. He tried to lock onto her with the seal he placed but it must have been damaged from her fall because it wouldn't activate, he couldn't even flash to her. He tried not to fear the worst but as he reached a particularly wrecked part of the city where the trail of destruction ended it was hard not to. Tears were streaming from his eyes as he fell to his knees, grabbing at chunks of rubble at random and pulling them away, sending them flying behind him as he tried to single-handedly excavate the building. He roared out in frustration, red chakra swirling around his body dangerously as 3 chakra tails swung violently behind him, destroying anything around him that was still standing in his anguish. Suddenly he turned, his eyes slitted and his elongated canines bared, as he locked onto the source of his pain. In a flash of speed rivaling his swift release, he appeared in the crater once again, staring across with furious eyes at the dispassionate man at the center. Pain just stood, observing the destruction he had brought in the name of his peace. He turned to see Naruto, watching the boy drop to all fours and glare at him. Now that you have known pain, maybe you can. Shut up. Naruto flashed across the clearing but was swiftly batted away as Pain raised his hand. The chakra-cloaked boy trembled in rage, trying again and again to breach the man's impenetrable guard only to get knocked back every time. He roared again in frustration before clutching his wrist as a sphere of chakra instantly formed, roughly the size of his head. Bigger. The ball expanded as he forced more chakra in, letting the sphere grow until it was larger than he was. Bigger. It grew again, making him have to hold it above his body or risk being pulled into the maelstrom of energies. Bigger, damn it. Red began to leak into the monumental Rasengan as it swelled to the size of a small building. With one last deafening roar, Naruto slammed the enormous sphere down, right on top of Pain. The release of energy it created almost rivaled that of Pain's village-shattering attack, the ground around the two of them being upturned as pure chakra ripped outwards, destroying everything in its path. Blay, where's the Kazekage? You two, go search through. About the girl. She should be around H. At's that over there. Quickly, I think it's. Ela Pulse, quickly, hand me that. You two, stop standing around and help me. Quickly, no. Abel, I think she's going to be. Right, we're done here, there are a lot more people that need help. Go to. Fu opened her eyes slowly, finding even that simple action difficult as her eyelids felt like they were made of lead. Groggily she glanced around, trying to discern anything about her surroundings from the fuzzy images her brain was receiving. She saw a lot of white, blindingly so, it was enough to make her close her eyes again in pain from the sterile fluorescent lights above her. She sighed, knowing where she was from even that small glimpse, it wasn't just Naruto who had an inherent hatred of hospitals. Onisan. She suddenly sat bolt upright in the bed, glancing around and completely ignoring the pain in her shoulder. She confirmed her previous theory, looking around the clean white hospital room with worry. It was empty of staff, but the few other beds in the room were occupied by a few other people. They all seemed to be injured to a certain degree, seemingly just minor wounds like broken bones or fractures, minor to her anyway. She could already feel Chomai's chakra knitting what was left of her injuries back together, the pain ebbing gradually. With a small high-pitched grunt she swiveled on the bed, shakily placing her feet against the cold ground. She was just about to push herself off the bed when the door to the room opened quietly, admitting a young nurse. She looked up from her clipboard with a frown, only to jump in surprise when she saw Fu nearly to her feet. There was a moment of pause as the woman just looked at her in shock before she rushed over, busying herself about Fu in worry. Oh, the doctor told me you wouldn't be waking up for a few more hours, never mind getting to your feet. Please lie back down, miss. Fu just shook her head, her eyes crinkling as she thought about her brother. Please, I have to see my Onisan. What happened? How did I get here? The nurse frowned again as she looked down at the young girl before her eyes caught the headband on the table next to her bed. She looked back to Fu before sighing, sitting down on the bed next to her. I don't know much, but there was some kind of explosion yesterday. Half the village was destroyed. Fu's eyes shot open in surprise, wondering what had the power to do such a thing. Am I right in saying your Onisan is Naruto Uzumaki? Fu nodded hesitantly, not liking the tone with which the nurse was speaking. It was the same type of voice parents use to break bad news to their kids while trying to save their feelings. He was involved somehow, he's. Fu's eyes opened a little wider as tears leaked out the corners. Is he dead? The nurse sat upright suddenly, turning to the younger girl immediately with an apologetic look as she waved her hands out in front of her. No, I'm sorry, no. Fu breathed deeply, releasing the breath she had been holding as she relaxed slightly. But he is in critical condition. Fu was straight back to worrying as she once again tried to push off the bed. The nurse put an arm across, and if Fu really tried, she could have easily pushed past, but she was tired, woozy, and weakened from whatever happened to her. Please, you were found under a pile of rubble near the edge of the crater, you shouldn't be moving around. In fact, when you came in, you had almost 10 broken bones. The fact that you're conscious is astounding. Fu chuckled sheepishly, knowing that it was her resident that allowed it. Please, I just want to see my Onisan. The nurse seemed conflicted as she looked between her clipboard, the rest of the patients in the room, and Fu. Finally, she turned around, staring into Fu's large orange eyes before sighing, more to herself than anything. Okay, fine, but only for a little bit and after I've checked on the other patients. Fu nodded quickly with a weak smile as the nurse quickly went about the room, checking the various clipboards that hung from the edge of the other patients' beds as well as quickly checking them over. Finally, she came back to Fu, offered a small smile, and helped the younger girl to her feet. Fu felt well enough to walk by herself, but it seemed the nurse wasn't quite ready to believe she was as healed as she claimed to be, as she maintained a firm, but gentle grip on her arm. The two of them made their way through the winding corridors of the hospital, snaking around other doctors and nurses. It had Fu blinking every time she saw another injured patient out in the corridors, the rooms apparently too full to hold everyone. As they made their way deeper into the Suna hospital, it became obvious the conditions of the patients became worse. Missing limbs replaced broken bones, and people were being actively rushed through on gurneys. It was true that the true battle was after the fights, in the hospital with the medics. Finally, the nurse, who by now Fu knew was called Musabi, hesitantly stood by a door before casting one last glance at Fu before opening it. The girl poked her head around the door cautiously, immediately noticing the 4 people inside. To one side, Gaara slept peacefully in a bed, not even looking injured thanks to his sand armor. To his right was Matsuri, her head lightly resting on Gaara's chest as she slept soundly in a chair, never having left his side for a moment. To the contrary, when Fu looked to the other side of the room, it was a mess of various machinery and complicated equipment. 2 blips echoed through the otherwise quiet room every few seconds, coming from the heart rate monitors hooked up to Naruto and Tayuya. Fu couldn't decide who looked worse. On the one side, it looked like Naruto's body had been ripped up in various places, the skin sometimes opened and lightly bleeding. The doctors had done what they could before they had to move on, stabilizing him so they could get to other patients. Then there was Tayuya. Some of her limbs were even more heavily bandaged than Naruto's, most set in casts. Her head especially was wrapped up in bandages so that only a small part of her normally noticeable red hair poked out. Both were attached to a drip that slowly released some clear substance into their blood as Fu blinked at the sight. She had never seen her brother so heavily injured. He would always just spring back from anything. The nurse just looked at her sadly. In any other case, the two would have been declared hopeless long ago, but somehow they had managed to stabilize them. It was a miracle the girl survived. By all accounts, her entire lower body should have been crushed by the rubble. By the time the medics found her, she had been using medical chakra to sustain herself. She has multiple broken bones, a severe concussion, and will most likely be comatose for a few weeks. The nurse sighed again as she looked over to the blonde. He was truly an enigma. None of the doctors even knew what was keeping him alive. As for your brother, he should be dead. He had over 50 broken bones, severe third-degree burns, what looks like critical radiation poisoning, and the worst case of chakra exhaustion we have ever seen. She sighed, knowing the boy would most likely be bombarded with questions from doctors when or if he ever woke up. Even now his body is healing itself at an extraordinary rate. Every time I come in he has less broken bones and the wounds just seem to knit back together. If I didn't know better, I'd swear it was some kind of Kekkei Genkai. Fu just nodded with determination. Her brother would be fine. It would take more than this to take him out for good. Although she did want to know what did this to him. The nurse looked at the girl again before sighing. She had other patients to check in with, and she knew the determined look on the girl's face. It had been the same for her when her brother broke his arm. She patted Fu on the shoulder before walking out. She seemed to be fine anyway, at least not severely injured. Fu shot her a thankful smile as she left before quickly making her way over to her brother's side. She would stay with him until the moment he woke up. It had taken Naruto almost 3 whole days to finally wake up, once again astounding the doctors with his rate of recovery. Gaara had woken up only a day after, with orders to take it easy for the next week. He had reassumed his position as Kazekage and waited patiently for his friends to recover. Like Fu had for him, Naruto stayed by Tayuya's side every minute that she was unconscious, only ever leaving to get food or to use the bathroom. Despite the doctor's assurances that she would be out for a long time, she managed to wake up after a week. One day her body had just remarkably lit up with green medical chakra, her wounds healing at an even more rapid pace than the doctors could manage, although they did facilitate it where they could. She woke up with blurry eyes and a splitting headache only to look down to see a mop of blonde hair resting on her stomach. She couldn't help but smile at the scene, knowing that Naruto probably hadn't left her side at all. She glanced around, trying to get an idea of how long she had been asleep for, but there wasn't even a clock in the sterile room. Sighing, she gently nudged Naruto's shoulders. When it looked like he wasn't going to respond, she gained a smirk. Sitting up slightly to get better leverage and ignoring the sudden burning pain in her side, she braced her arms against Naruto's body. Hey shithead, wakey wakey. She roughly pushed him off with a smile, once again hiding the pain that even that simple action had cost her. She knew that whatever it was that took her out was going to keep her from active duty for some time, probably a few weeks at least. She laughed as Naruto woke up, even as he was tipping back. Despite his honed reflexes, he could do almost nothing as he tumbled backwards except brace his arms. He looked up at the ceiling, slightly dazed and confused before picking himself up and dusting himself off. He suddenly stopped mid-action as he turned to look at the bed with wide disbelieving eyes. Tayuya-chan. He launched himself over, wrapping up Tayuya in a strong and warm hug that was surprisingly gentle. Her body gave no protests as he wrapped her up. The doctors said you would be out for ages, but I knew you'd be awake in no time. Tayuya just smiled at the way he fussed over her, even if he didn't try to make it look that way. Well, I'm sore as shit and feel like I haven't eaten anything for a month. How long have I been out? Naruto smiled fondly, happy that even so soon after waking up Tayuya was still herself. About 8 days, I kinda lost count. Time just sort of stands still in hospitals. As he said it, he looked around in disdain, even if he now had a sort of begrudging respect for the establishment that had probably saved both their lives, or at least Tayuya's. 8 days, huh? That must have been one fucking big explosion. Naruto nodded again, this time with a frown as the memories of his final encounter with pain flashed through his mind. Yeah, that bastard really did a number on the village. They've started fixing it, but there's really only so much you can do with a giant crater. Tayuya's eyes shot up in surprise. She had been caught by the blast, so was already unconscious before she saw anything. Even from the way Naruto said it, she knew the damage had to be extensive. Gaara still has to take it easy, but once he's back to 100% he can start fixing the worst of the damage. Turns out being able to form buildings with nothing but chakra is pretty useful. Tayuya just smirked in agreement, also glad that Gaara was okay. So from everything I've heard, I take it I pretty much got the worst of it. Naruto just nodded. In truth, Tayuya was really the only one who took the attack head on. Everybody else was only damaged by the damage it caused afterwards. Yeah. Before he came to fight, Gaara had all the available shinobi come and evacuate the civilians for the area. It was a good thing too. They only had orders to interfere if it looked like we couldn't hold our own. That all kind of broke down when Pain decided to blow a massive hole in the village. Tayuya was now very curious. The way Naruto kept speaking about it, the damage to Suna was massive, but she just couldn't fathom one person devastating an entire village. She looked towards the window, but they were on the ground floor and she wasn't at a great angle to look out over the village. She sighed, supposing she would be able to see it once she was out of the hospital. So what happened after I got knocked out? I assume Pain was sent packing with his tail between his legs. Naruto nodded solemnly, pulling something out from behind him before he tossed a badly damaged and slightly singed headband on Tayuya's lap. Yeah, you could say that. Tayuya just blinked in surprise. Naruto had taken down somebody who could level a small village, and to her he didn't really look all that injured, even if he winced in pain every so often when he would move his side too much. She could get the details from him later. Right now she suddenly felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Already her eyelids were beginning to droop as she let out a small yawn. Naruto just smiled kindly when he saw this, placing his hand over hers as she began to doze off. I'll be here when you wake up. Tayuya just nodded sleepily, not really hearing what he said, but she found his warm voice soothing. Suna was now well on its way to recovery. As long as Gaara had chakra, he was able to erect buildings to the exact specification of the construction supervisors. The massive crater that had scarred his beloved village shrank every day as life began to return to normal. There were surprisingly few casualties in the village as a whole, most of the civilians having been successfully evacuated to areas not affected by the full-scale Shinra Tensei. However, for one individual, things were nowhere near normal. Naruto currently sat in his room in the Kazekage mansion, deep in thought over the large scroll laid out over his desk. Numerous smaller scrolls surrounded him, some scrunched up, now useless, and others having been furiously scribbled over only to be immediately crossed out again. He hadn't managed to shave in the last few days, and his adolescent beard adorning his chin caused him to itch every now and then. Tayuya made a joking remark that he finally had whiskers on other places on his face, which had drawn a laugh from him and Fu. He made sure to visit her as much as possibly, but as much as she enjoyed his company and attention, he tended to be a bit smothering. Now he spent his free time working on the one problem that had managed to elude him for so long now. The door to his room opened a crack. He noticed but paid it no real mind. He just assumed it was Gaara or Matsuri coming to see him. He was surprised then when a veil of red hair suddenly fell across his eyes as he was wrapped up in a large and warm hug. When he was finally released, he turned with a smile to see Tayuya standing next to him, leaning against a single crutch as she tried to actively avoid putting pressure on her more badly damaged leg. Once she had regained consciousness, her own medical expertise had greatly sped up her recovery, but the doctors had still refused to release her. Apparently they had changed their minds, or at least somebody had changed their minds for them. He smiled, knowing that sooner or later Tayuya always got her way, no matter who was standing as an obstacle. Tayuya, why didn't you tell me you got out today? I would have helped you. Tayuya playfully slapped him around the back of his head as she gently eased herself onto his lap. Wouldn't have been much of a fucking surprise then, would it? Naruto just chuckled softly as he naturally wrapped one of his arms around her waist and planted a chaste kiss on her lips, at least until she slapped him again. Anyway, it's not like I'm some bratty kid who can't even walk from the hospital to her own house. Naruto just nodded, knowing better than to disagree with her. She was just as stubborn as he was, and they would have been arguing over it for ages. Cool, so how long until we can spar? He only said it jokingly, but Tayuya just smirked, standing up with some care before looking down at him defiantly. I'll take you right here, shithead, just bring it. However, despite her jovial and slightly joking words, she was unprepared for the blur that suddenly swept her off her feet. The two of them were across the room in moments before Naruto gently set her down on the bed before joining her. Tayuya just huffed, pouting as she crossed her arms under her chest. She didn't enjoy being defeated so easily. Hey, no fair, I want a rematch. She didn't get much further before Naruto firmly pressed his lips up against hers. They parted almost a minute later, with Tayuya's eyelids half-lidded and her mouth in a smile. Not exactly what I was getting at, but I think that was good too. Naruto just stared at her in half amusement, crossing his arms over his own chest as he pouted. Only good. Must be losing my touch. Tayuya just grinned happily like an academy student who aced a test. Oh, I think I can help with that. Suffice it to say that neither of them were seen or heard from for the rest of that night. Fu sat on Naruto's shoulders as they both stood and watched Gaara effortlessly construct a house. The sand flowed around him in a stream, being directed by the various site planners and architects before solidifying into a rock-hard sandstone-like wall or floor. In all, almost half of the crater had been refilled and almost the entire residential district had been repaired. Thanks to the low casualty and injury rates, nearly all of the active shinobi were still fit for missions, so Suna didn't take any massive hits to its economy. Fu watched Gaara work in awe, always amazed by his natural ability to bend the sands to his will. It made her long for her own special ability like it, even if her Biju did allow her to fly. Likewise, Naruto watched his friend actively take part in the reconstruction effort, showing that even the Kazekage would pitch in to help. He was still too injured to be doing any heavy lifting, so for now he watched from the sidelines, but as soon as he could he would do his bit as well. He had his large scroll slung over his shoulder. Nowadays he really didn't go anywhere without it, so he could jot down any thoughts that came to him on the fly. Tayuya had started walking without her crutches the day before, almost 3 weeks after what had now been dubbed the pain incident by everybody who knew of the attack in detail, namely anybody of rank Chunin or higher. The official story was that Suna had been attacked by an unknown enemy of incredible power but had been swiftly defeated by the Kazekage, Fu, Naruto, and Tayuya. It was more for morale than anything else, even though it was true, if slightly exaggerated, people needed an inspirational story in times of hardship. As he walked down the street, Naruto noticed more and more people looking at him in admiration, hearing how he had been the one to defeat the leader of the attack. Even now, the smaller, but still devastating crater at the center of the destruction stood testament to the power of the Rasengan he had used to defeat Pain. Subconsciously, he fiddled with one of the rings on his hand, still not having bothered to work out a way to take him off yet. Now that Tayuya was well enough to walk unaided, he knew that Gaara would want to be talking to them both later on. Naruto stood in front of Gaara's desk with Tayuya on his back. It wasn't really because she was too injured to walk, far from it, he just enjoyed carrying her around and she enjoyed being carried. It also slightly irritated Gaara that they would act so immaturely in the Kazekige's office, even if he insisted on losing the formalities between them. Currently, the young Kazekige was glancing through a report on the current repairs to the village. He would be out helping like usual, but he felt this meeting as too important to be put off for much longer. Alright, we've had some rest for now, but we can't put off the fact that Akatsuki are no doubt still out there, plotting what to do. Tayuya looked at her friend oddly, a questioning look on her face as she glanced between him and Naruto, who didn't seem surprised by the news. What? I thought that Naruto killed their leader. Gaara steepled his fingers, almost imitating Tsunade as he leaned forward on the desk. While it appears that both Naruto and I have our doubts to the man calling himself Pain to be the Akatsuki's true leader. Naruto just nodded, upsetting Tayuya that he hadn't discussed these concerns with her before now. Yeah, Gaara's right. During our fight he only called himself a vessel for a higher power. It might have all been gibberish, but we can't rule out the fact that the real leader might be out there somewhere. There's also the fact that all of the opponents we faced shared the same eyes. We don't know what that means, but we're sure it's significant somehow. Tayuya nodded uncertainly, a frown marring her features. Alright, so Akatsuki still might be out there, but so what? We still can't do anything about it. It's not like we know where they are or anything. Gaara just shook his head solemnly as he pulled out a few headbands from the drawers, laying them out on his desk. All of them were the same, all bearing the symbol for a Megacore, and all of them slashed to indicate missing nin status. All of our opponents wore headbands identical to these, yet the ones that have been identified since then have shown them to be of different villages. Tayuya furrowed her brow again in thought. So they wanted to implicate Am, is that it? Again Gaara shook his head, staring intently at the headbands. No. If that was the goal, the headbands would not have been slashed. Why would they assume the identities of missing nin from Am if they weren't from the village? Tayuya quieted down again, now in thought about the strangeness presented by the unusual headbands. In any case, I at least believe it deserves looking into. Tayuya nodded quickly, as did Naruto, who had already been thinking along the same lines as Gaara for a while now. When Gaara swiveled on his chair, he had a perfect view of the scarred crater from his window, and it always made him pensive to look at. Not until you are recovered completely. If it turns out there is something of significance in a Megacore, then I want you at 100% to make sure I'm not sending you to your death. Tayuya almost seemed ready to protest, but the dull ache throughout her body told her otherwise, and she just nodded silently. In any case, you will have 2 weeks to recover and gain your strength back. I'm sure there are things you can also work on without the use of your body, as I'm sure there is for Naruto as well. Both of them nodded. Good. Then get some rest. You're no good to the village if you overwork yourselves. He relieved another 2 nods before Naruto spoke up. So who would be going to Am? Gaara nodded, having predicted this would be one of the first things Naruto asked. Only yourself and Tayuya. It is probably best for an information-gathering mission to keep a low profile, and too many people would only attract attention to yourselves. Besides, with your shadow clones and Tayuya's genjutsu, you are more than able to complete this mission by yourselves. Naruto nodded with a frown. So this is just recon. Gaara nodded, sliding the headbands off his desk and back into a drawer. Yes, although if you are threatened, you have my permission to protect yourselves. Avoid unnecessary conflict if possible. Am are not our enemies at the moment, and it would be preferable to keep it that way. He got more nods from his 2 friends, although Tayuya was smirking as she did so. So what about Fu? Gaara smiled softly, looking at Naruto in a mix between amusement and understanding. I know you care for her, Naruto, but she is a full-fledged Kunoichi, not to mention almost 14 years old now. You can't be watching over her forever. If the mission goes well, you will be back in the village in no more than 3 weeks. Until then she is more than welcome to stay at the mansion as she has been doing. Otherwise you could always ask Gurren to keep an eye on her. However, she is now a Junin of Sunagakure, so she will be going on missions and won't always be available. Naruto nodded hesitantly, unsure of the idea of leaving Fu for so long. They had never been apart for any extended period of time before. Don't worry about little minty shithead, she'll be fine and you know it. She took down one of those Akatsuki goons, didn't she? Naruto gained a little more confidence, smiling in pride as he thought about Fu's accomplishment. Alright, but promise you'll keep her out of trouble. Gaara nodded with a smile. I won't have to. Matsuri has taken an almost motherly liking towards her and she'll keep an eye on her even without me asking. At least that had Naruto feeling more reassured by that. Alright then, we'll let you know when we're fully recovered. Gaara nodded again as Naruto and Tayuya let themselves out. He had no doubt they would want to get back to full capacity as soon as possible, but this whole event was certainly eye-opening for the young Kage. It was almost reaching the time Naruto and Tayuya would have to leave the village for Am, and Naruto was packing their supplies into various seals around their bodies. Tayuya had recovered enough to begin physical training about a week ago now, and from then the both of them had been slowly working their abilities back up to an acceptable level. In the meantime they had both been working on their individual projects, Tayuya on her genjutsu which she felt she'd been neglecting recently, and Naruto his work in modifying the seal safely. Tayuya was on the bed, stretched out in just her panties and one of Naruto's older shirts that fit her. It was taking all of Naruto's self-control not to abandon his attempts at packing and go over and just roll around with her for a while. She had a way of looking unbelievably safe even in the simplest of clothes, and secretly Naruto believed she did it on purpose just to tease him. Right now she was lying on her stomach with her arms hanging over the edge of the bed reading a book Naruto didn't recognize. What are you reading? Tayuya didn't answer. She instead just raised the book so he could read the title, Tale of a Gutsy Ninja. He didn't recognize the name, but he certainly recognized the author. The small picture of the white-haired Sannin smirked at him from the back cover. I thought the next issue of Make Out hadn't come out yet. Tayuya sighed, placing a bookmark on the page she was reading before propping herself up on the bed with a look that clearly told Naruto she had been enjoying it until he interrupted. It's not from the Make Out series. It's some kind of book he wrote a while back when he was just getting into writing. It's actually pretty good. There's none of the smut like he normally writes. She chuckled suddenly. Maybe he wasn't always a pervert after all. Naruto smirked at that as well, not believing there was ever a time Jiraiya wasn't perverted. What's it about? Tayuya just shrugged, already returning to where she was, completely ignoring her boyfriend as she got back into the book. Read it and find out. Naruto just nodded, returning to what he was doing while trying to ignore the alluring position Tayuya was unwittingly lying in, or possibly deliberately, he could never tell. He thought about what they were going to have to do in Am. He didn't know much about the village except it was hit pretty hard in the Second Shinobi War and has been slowly recovering ever since. He did know that with his luck, it was going to get interesting pretty quickly. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.